As Minas Tirith is crumbling under the might of Mordor, as the great city of men faces total destruction, you're probably asking yourself, where are the elves? In the films, we get this incredible scene of their power at Helm's Deep, that line of shining mail and graceful blades holding back the darkness. But then, when Gondor, the last great shield of men, faces its final test, they're gone. The sky is swarming with Nazgul on their fell beasts, the ground is shaking with orcs and war machines, but you won't see a single elven banner. This wasn't an oversight, and it definitely wasn't a betrayal. It was a harsh reality of the War of the Ring that the films just don't have time to show. This is a story about a war fought on many fronts, the tragic end of an entire age, and the painful need for the elves to let men find their own strength. To understand why the elves didn't ride to Gondor's rescue, we have to look north, beyond the fields of Pelennor, to the forests and hidden valleys where the elves were fighting a desperate war of their own. Before we get to the truth, we have to talk about one of the most powerful and iconic scenes in Peter Jackson's movies, the arrival of the elves at Helm's Deep. We all remember it. Just when it seems like all hope is lost for the defenders, a horn echoes, and a company of Galadriel marches into the fortress in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the rain. Haldir of Lorien greets Aragorn and Théoden, announcing he has a message from Elrond, an army of elves, sent to honor the last alliance between elves and men. It's a breathtaking moment, a real surge of hope, and it does a really important job for the movie. It visually shows the ancient bond between the two races and raises the stakes. But, and this is the key to understanding everything else, it never happened in the book. In J.R.R. Tolkien's version, the only elf at the Battle of Helm's Deep was Legolas, fighting alongside his friend Gimli. The defenders of the Hornburg were men, and men alone. Jackson's choice to add the elves was a narrative shortcut, a way to show a complex history of alliances in one powerful shot. And while it's great for the film, it creates a major question for viewers when those same elves are missing from the much bigger, much more important siege of Minas Tirith. If they'd help Rohan, why not Gondor? The truth is, their absence in the books is even more stark and way more important. Their non-appearance at Pelennor Fields isn't a plot hole. It's a central theme. It signals a massive shift in how the world works. The filmmaker's change, while visually stunning, covers up a deeper, sadder story. The real story isn't about why the elves chose not to help, but why they couldn't and, on a deeper level, why they shouldn't. To find that answer, we have to look at the map of Middle-earth and see the full, terrifying scope of Sauron's grand strategy. Now, a common misconception is that the War of the Ring was only fought in the south. Right on Mordor's doorstep, we see the epic battles for Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith and assume the rest of Middle-earth was just holding its breath. That's not even close to the truth. Sauron was a master strategist, and his plan was to hit everyone, everywhere, all at once. His goal was to divide and conquer so that none of his enemies could help each other. So while the main army of Mordor marched on Gondor, Sauron unleashed his northern armies to pin down every other potential ally. So, as Gondor fought for its life, the elves weren't just sitting around in their magical forests. They were under a full-scale assault. Sauron's main base for this northern war was the fortress of Dol Guldur in southern Mirkwood. From this dark fortress, commanded by the Nazgul Khamul, Sauron launched a massive attack aimed at the two greatest elven kingdoms left in Middle-earth, Lothlórien and the woodland realm of Thranduil. The dates in Tolkien's appendices tell a stark story. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields was fought on March 15, 3019. On that exact same day, an army from Dol Guldur invaded King Thranduil's realm in northern Mirkwood. This was the Battle Under the Trees, a brutal, fiery conflict fought in the ancient woods that were Legolas's home. Sauron's forces brought fire and destruction, and a great ruin of fire swept through the forest as Thranduil and his people fought desperately to defend their homes. At the same time, the Golden Wood of Lothlórien was also under siege. According to the appendices, Lorien was assaulted 3 separate times by armies from Dol Guldur on March 11th, March 15th, and March 22nd. Think about that timing. The second attack on Lorien was happening on the very same day that Minas Tirith was burning. The beautiful woods on the borders of Lorien were horribly burned, and only the incredible skill of the Galadrim, combined with the immense power of Galadriel and her ring, Nenya, held back the invasion. Tolkien even says that Lorien was so powerful it couldn't have been defeated unless Sauron himself had come there. This was Sauron's dark genius. He didn't just send a small force to keep the elves busy, he sent armies to destroy them. The journey from the Elven realms to Gondor would have taken weeks anyway, but Sauron's strategy made it impossible. They were locked in a fight for their own survival, their forces totally committed to defending their own homes. The elves didn't aid Gondor because they were already at war. So let's take a closer look at these northern fronts, because they weren't just skirmishes. These were major battles in the War of the Ring that often get overlooked. In Lothlórien, things were desperate. 3 huge assaults in 11 days. Imagine the strain on the elves of the Golden Wood. These weren't just orc raids, these were organized armies from Dol Guldur, swarming across the Anduin River to burn the last great elven realm to the ground. The borders of the forest were set ablaze, and the famous golden malorn trees were blackened by the enemy's malice. The defense of Lorien depended heavily on Galadriel. Her ring, Nenya, the Ring of Water, was a shield of immense power. It wasn't a weapon, but a tool of preservation and protection, and her strength created a barrier around the woods that the enemy couldn't break. This power, along with the leadership of her husband, Celeborn, is what drove the invaders back 3 times. And after the final assault was beaten and news of Sauron's fall arrived, they didn't just sit back. Celeborn led the host of Lorien across the river, took Dol Guldur, and Galadriel herself came and threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. This was no sideshow. This was the final, winning act in a war that had raged for thousands of years. Meanwhile, further north in Mirkwood, King Thranduil, Legolas's father, was facing his own nightmare. His own father had died fighting Sauron in the last alliance, so Thranduil knew the Dark Lord's evil firsthand. The battle under the trees was a long and bitter fight. The orcs brought great ruin of fire, trying to burn the elves out of their own kingdom. The fighting raged among the ancient trees in a desperate struggle to keep the shadow from swallowing the whole forest. Thranduil ultimately won, but it was a hard victory that cost his kingdom dearly. And what about Rivendell? Because it was so well hidden, Imladris wasn't directly attacked, but that doesn't mean it wasn't involved. Elrond's aid was strategic and personal. He sent his own sons, Elladan and Elrohir, to ride south with the Dúnedain. They joined Aragorn as part of the Grey Company, a small group of about 30 rangers from the north who came to help their chieftain. And they brought a critical message from Elrond. The days are short. If thou art in haste, remember the paths of the dead. This elven counsel is what guided Aragorn to the army of the dead, which allowed him to wipe out the corsairs of Umbar and arrive at the Pelennor fields with a fresh army at the perfect moment. It was a different kind of help, not a shining army, but a piece of vital wisdom and the loyalty of kin that turned the tide of the entire battle. But here's the thing. Even if the Elven kingdoms hadn't been under attack, it's still unlikely they would have marched on Minas Tirith. The practical reasons, the war in the north, the sheer distance are only part of it. To really get it, we have to go deeper, into the very heart of what it meant to be an elf at the end of the Third Age. The real answer lies in one of Tolkien's most powerful themes, the fading of the elves. By the time of the War of the Ring, the elves were a people in twilight. Their glory days were thousands of years in the past. The massive armies that fought Sauron in the Second Age were gone. For centuries, the Firstborn had been leaving Middle-earth, sailing from the Grey Havens to the Undying Lands. They were growing weary of a world that was being taken over by the younger, faster breeding race of men. The realms that were left, like Lorien and Rivendell, were beautiful, enchanted relics of an older time, but they were shadows of their former strength. And crucially, their power had a different purpose now. The 3 elven rings, Nenya, Vilya, and Narya, held by Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, were not weapons of war. They weren't made for conquest. Their power was for preservation, healing, and stopping the decay of time. Galadriel used Nenya to keep Lothlórien timeless and beautiful. Elrond used Vilya to protect Rivendell as a haven of peace. The entire point of these rings was to create sanctuaries against the world, not to raise armies to conquer it. The elves knew that if the one ring was destroyed, the power of their 3 rings would also fade. The magic that kept their realms timeless would vanish, and they would eventually become a rustic folk of dell and cave. They faced a terrible choice: let Sauron win and be enslaved, or destroy the One Ring and accept the end of their own age in Middle-earth. They chose to save the world by sacrificing their own. This is the tragedy of the elves in the Third Age. They are no longer the main characters of history. Their role is to guide, to counsel, and to remember what was beautiful. They fought to defend their homes, sure, but their greater purpose was to hold on just long enough for men to be ready to stand on their own. Their absence at Minas Tirith wasn't just about logistics. It was a symptom of their long, slow, heartbreaking exit from the world stage. And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most important, reason for the elves' absence. Their decision wasn't one of indifference, it was one of wisdom. The wisest among them, like Elrond and Galadriel, understood that the Third Age was the final test for the race of men. The Fourth Age was meant to be the dominion of men, and for that to happen, men had to earn it. Think back to the Council of Elrond. It wasn't a typical council of war. The decision made wasn't to send the combined armies of the Free Peoples to attack Mordor. They tried that once before, in the last alliance, and while they beat Sauron, it ultimately failed because of the weakness of men, specifically Isildur failing to destroy the ring. Elrond saw that failure with his own eyes. He knew another big army wouldn't solve the problem. The world couldn't be saved by elven armies again. It had to be saved by a different kind of strength. The plan they chose was one of stealth and hope, a tiny fellowship, with the burden placed not on a mighty elven warrior, but on a hobbit, the smallest and seemingly weakest of them all. This was on purpose. It symbolized that the fate of the world would now depend on courage and resilience, not on great power. If the elves had shown up at Minas Tirith with a huge army, it would have completely undermined this entire theme. It would have robbed men of their defining moment. The charge of the Rohirrim, Aragorn's return as the rightful king, all of this was part of men proving they were worthy of inheriting the world. Aragorn couldn't become king because an elven army put him on the throne. He had to win his crown through the strength and loyalty of his own people. The elves' greatest contribution to the war wasn't an army of archers, but their willingness to step back. It was a gift of trust. By holding their own fronts in the north, they gave the south the chance it needed. By offering counsel, like Elrond's advice about the paths of the dead, they gave wisdom without taking over. Their absence, in a way, was their final and greatest act of faith in the race of men. It was a painful and necessary letting go. The age of the elves was over. Their song was fading into memory. For the song of men to begin, they had to first be given the silence in which to sing it. Their absence wasn't abandonment. It was the final, painful step in allowing the world of men to be born. So, why didn't the elves aid Gondor in its darkest hour? The answer is a mix of hard military reality and deep, bittersweet themes. They didn't come because they couldn't. Sauron's brilliant strategy had them pinned down, fighting a desperate war on their own soil in Mirkwood and Lothlórien. They weren't absent from the War of the Ring. They were fighting it across the entire north. They didn't come because their time was over. They were a fading people, their numbers shrinking and their power used to preserve the last lights of a dying age, not wage new wars. They willingly chose a future where their own magic would end for the freedom of everyone else. And finally, they didn't come because they knew this wasn't their fight to win. The Fourth Age was dawning, and it had to be won by men, for men. To intervene would have been to rob humanity of its chance to face its ultimate test and claim its own destiny. Their absence wasn't indifference. It was the final, painful, and wisest gift from a fading age to a rising one. What do you think? Was the elves' decision a necessary sacrifice for the future of Middle-earth, or was it a tragic failure to uphold an ancient alliance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Middle-earth, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories from the world of J.R.R. Tolkien. Thanks for watching.